All right, let's dive right into a really fascinating puzzle at the very heart of New Testament studies. We're talking about the words of Jesus in the Gospels. How did they get there? Were they all perfectly remembered and passed down word for word? Or was something else going on in those early Christian communities? So here's the big question. There's this idea that's been debated by scholars for a long, long time. Could early Christian prophets, feeling inspired by the Holy Spirit, have actually spoken new words in the voice of the resurrected Christ? And could those prophetic sayings have ended up in the Gospels, right alongside the words of the historical Jesus? It's a pretty radical idea, right? But what's the actual evidence for it? To really get to the bottom of this, we're going to follow the trail of evidence laid out by the scholar Richard Bauckham. First, we'll look at the puzzle itself. Then, we're going clue hunting in the book of Revelation. After that, we'll zero in on two key parables, unpack a really cool process called deparabolization. Don't worry, it's not as complicated as it sounds. And finally, we'll see where all this evidence leads us. Okay, so first things first. Why is this so tough to figure out? Well, the biggest problem is that when the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke were being formed, there just wasn't a lot of clear evidence left behind. We can't just point to a text and say, see, right there, that's a prophet inventing a saying. To really test the theory, we need a solid case study. And that brings us to our primary crime scene, if you will, the book of Revelation. Why here? Because it's the only place in all of first century Christian writing where we can be absolutely sure we're seeing a prophet, in this case John, delivering messages directly in the first-person voice of the risen Jesus. So if prophets were inventing new sayings, this is ground zero. This is where we should find the smoking gun. So let's put on our detective hats and start sifting through the words of Christ in Revelation. We're on the lookout for specific kinds of sayings, the ones that feel like they could have been created by a prophet and might be similar to what we find in the Gospels. Now, what Bauckham's analysis shows is that most of Christ's words in Revelation are really tied to the specific context of the book's visions. But there are a few short, what you might call detachable sayings that could stand on their own. These fall into two basic camps. Some are basically creative reworkings of Old Testament verses. The others, though, and these are the ones we're interested in, seem to have a clear echo of sayings from the Synoptic Gospels. This really helps us narrow our focus. We're zooming in on two specific verses in Revelation that are absolutely key to this whole argument. The claim is that these aren't new, freshly invented sayings from a prophet. Nope. The argument is that they are actually direct adaptations of two of Jesus's most well-known parables, the parable of the thief and the parable of the watching servants. So to really get what's happening in Revelation, we've got to go back to the source material in the Gospels. These two parables are all about the same thing, the unexpected return of the Master, what theologians call the parousia, and the urgent need for his followers to be ready at all times. Okay, first up, the parable of the thief from Luke. The core idea is super simple. The Master's return is going to be sudden. It's going to be unexpected, just like a thief breaking in. It's a warning to anyone who isn't prepared. The key feeling here is surprise. Now listen to this from Revelation. Behold, I am coming like a thief. Whoa! I mean, the echo is just unmistakable, right? The prophet John, speaking as the risen Christ, is taking the central image from that parable and using it directly. But notice, he's not retelling the story. He's using the image as a direct, punchy warning. And what's really cool is we can actually trace how this image developed over time. It didn't just pop up in Revelation out of thin air. In the earliest version we have, from the Q source, which we see in Luke, it's all about that raw unexpectedness. Then Matthew comes along and adds the detail about it happening at night and a command to stay awake. Then the Apostle Paul in 1 Thessalonians coins that famous phrase, like a thief in the night. And finally, Revelation combines Paul's simile with Matthew's command. This looks a lot more like a shared, evolving tradition, not some brand new invention. And guess what? We see the exact same pattern with our second example. The parable of the watching servants in Luke is a story about servants waiting up for their master to get home from a party. They have to be ready to open the door the second he knocks. And that story is the direct source for that incredibly famous line in Revelation, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock." Again, it's an echo, an allusion, not something new. And all this leads us to the central theory here. So how in the world did a narrative story, a parable, morph into a short, first-person command from Jesus? Well, Bauckham gives this process a name. It's called deparabolization. Now, I know it sounds super academic and jargony, but the actual idea is pretty simple. Here's the key. Deparabolization is what happens when the story itself kind of dissolves, but it leaves behind its most powerful images as direct instructions. So, instead of a story about servants with lamps, you just get the direct command, keep your lamps burning. The story transforms into a direct order. And you can see this process happening right here. On the left, from Luke's Gospel, you have part of the story's description. On the right, from another early Christian text called the Didache, you see that exact same imagery, but now it's been turned into a series of direct commands. The story has literally been taken apart, and its pieces have been redeployed as instructions. Let's just walk through it real quick. Step 1, you start with a story. Step 2, you identify the key metaphors, the powerful images, like burning lamps, watching at the door, being ready. Step 3, you pull those metaphors right out of the narrative and you turn them into commands. And the result? You get a list of direct exhortations that can be used in preaching or teaching, completely separate from the original story they came from. And this right here is the absolute key to the whole argument. This process was about changing the form of the tradition, not creating new substance. Think of it like repackaging, not inventing. The prophets and teachers weren't just making up new teachings out of thin air. They were finding new, more direct ways to apply the teachings they already had from Jesus' parables. So, this brings us to our final section, where we get to pull all these threads together. With all this evidence in front of us, what can we really say about the role that early Christian prophets played in shaping the Gospels? Well, the evidence from Revelation, our one really solid test case, points to a surprisingly conservative conclusion. It suggests that these prophets saw themselves as faithful transmitters of the Jesus tradition. Their influence was on the form, changing parables into commands, but not on the substance. They don't appear to be inventing new stories or sayings from whole cloth. And in that sense, their job of adapting the tradition wasn't all that different from what any good teacher or preacher would do. So the big idea that Revelation proves prophets were creative inventors, it just doesn't seem to hold up. And this brings us to the final, starkest piece of evidence. How many brand new, creatively invented parables attributed to Jesus can we find in the book of Revelation? The answer is 0. Not a single one. All we find are these echoes, these allusions, and these adaptations of a tradition that was already there. So instead of thinking of early prophets as these radical innovators, creating new words of Jesus on the fly, this evidence paints a very different picture. It looks like they saw themselves more as guardians and interpreters of the tradition, carefully working with the material they had received and adapting it for the new challenges their communities were facing. Now, this doesn't mean the tradition was frozen or static, not at all. This process of deparabolization actually shows a living, breathing, two-way street. The remembered words of Jesus were shaping the church's teaching, for sure. But at the same time, the teaching needs of the church were shaping the form in which those words were remembered and passed on. It was all about adaptation, not creation. And all of this leaves us with one last big question to think about. If the prophets who influenced the gospel tradition were more like careful transmitters than radical creators, how does that change the way we read the Gospels today? It might just suggest a tradition that was a bit more controlled and maybe more deeply rooted in the memory of the historical Jesus than some scholars have thought.